Sure. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, men, for joining. I think that this is a very timely topic, both for the sort of the standard definition of grief, the loss of a parent, a loved one. But I think the bigger definition of grief is something that, as Paul talked about, I think we've all been touching. And I'm very pleased to introduce the speaker tonight, John Kraft. Been one of the men who welcomed me when I moved up from South Central to the Heartland community. He was the area steward for Heartland at that time, area steward emeritus now, a co-leader in the project, and a man who, in my judgment, has a lot of wisdom. So I think John has a great presentation tonight. We'll do about a 30-minute or so presentation. We'll then separate into a number of breakout rooms where we can have a deep dive on discussions on some of the gateways of grief, and then we'll come back together. So thank you again. I imagine we'll continue to have men join here, but thank you very much. And John.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm actually quite excited to talk about grief, even though it's a difficult subject. I believe it's one that has some real gifts that it can grant us. My personal belief is that we are called to the challenge of being fully human. If I was to say what my job is in this life, it's to become fully human, which I would then go on to say to be fully expressed, to be fully authentic. And I think particularly right now that we are challenged to do that in a challenging time. And the question of how do we make sense of all that's going on and all of the emotions that is stirring up. And if you would just pause for just a moment and kind of take stock of what some of the emotions are that you have felt, if we use the standard 6 categories of mad, glad, sad, fear, guilt, and shame, which of those have you touched on? And we'll spend some more time with that. But the point being that this is a time of a real soup of emotions. And my belief is that if we take a look at grief a little deeper, that we might be able to sort out some of that and have it actually make more sense. And my personal belief is that grief may be the dominant emotion that we're feeling, and all the others are subgroups of that. As Brian just explained, I'll talk for 25, maybe 30 minutes right now, and I'm going to present quite a bit of stuff. Note that my contact information is in the chat room. At any point, if you decide you want to reach out to me, you can either write that down or just leave your contact information in the chat room, and we'll collect that at the end and save it, and I can reach out to you personally. But I welcome interactions. I do not hold myself up as an expert on grief, but I am I'll say I'm a student of grief. I believe it has a lot to teach. And once I've done that, then we will go into breakout rooms for probably only around 12 minutes or so, and then we'll come back as a group, have some more discussion, and I have some final things to give you, including what I hope are some tools to take home in your toolbox of how you personally and in your groups can support men as they process their grief. When we teach the 6 basic groups of emotion, and one of them being what we, in our shorthand, we call sad, grief would lie on one end of that continuum of what sadness might be. And grief is a deep emotion, and I believe that part of its power lies in the fact that it is about losing something that is of such value to me that it touches my soul. It touches the core of my being. And there's really no way to go around an experience that causes grief. Ultimately, one must pass through. We do spend a lot of energy sometimes in denial or trying to avoid, maybe even numbing. And my experience is that all of those techniques, all they do is cause havoc in other parts of our life and in other parts of our relationship. Yet in our culture, we've been taught to avoid anything that's discomforting, and maybe especially grief. And we have institutionalized it and compartmentalized it. And it seems like we're given the message that there's only some places and only a certain amount of time is it okay to grieve. Perhaps you've been gifted with a different situation, but that's what I observed, and that's kind of the message I got when I was growing up. And I think there's an additional conundrum in that in MKP, we're kind of given a bad name to being in the victim role. We talk about it as a way to that if we talk about something happens and it makes us feel a certain way, that we're giving away our power. And ultimately, there's truth to that if I'm to be fully accountable and responsible for my life, I am the one who makes the choices that creates my reality. But I invite you to hold the paradox, because bad things do happen to good people. And even though ultimately I get to decide how I process and what choices I make from those bad events, if I move too quickly through, if I don't linger and pause and process my grief, then I shortchange that opportunity to be fully human, to be fully authentic. So I invite you to, particularly when you're working with men at this point, and you feel like they're stuck in victimhood or they've grieved long enough, take a moment and realize that might be exactly what needs to happen at this time. That there is a difference, I believe, between being victim and grieving. And I'm not going to try to dissect that this evening, but I'll point out that we do have within MKP a culture that does not necessarily nurture men really diving deep into their grief. I want to give a quote by Carl Jung here at this point, and it's fairly long, but I invite you to listen. And he's talking about this connection between grief and soul. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid feeling their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Embrace your grief, for there your soul will grow. So, a double message here. Yes, grief hurts, and grief has possible rewards that make it worthwhile. And I will personally acknowledge I'm scared about grief. I'm scared to be dangled over that abyss that grief sometimes seems to be. And one of the things that we'll talk about is that our psyche actually knows not to try to grieve alone. That is, not to dive too deep alone. We need the support of others if we're to deeply grieve. And there's a combination of fear and discomfort, lack of safety, that my reptilian brain, my old brain, screams out at me that, hey, you're in danger here, you might actually die. And because of that discomfort, I tend to run away, or I tend to try to numb it out or distract myself with busyness. There's all kinds of ways that I witness other people use to try to avoid or at least postpone dealing with their grief. On the weekend, when I have the opportunity to lead the process that we call Intro to Feelings, I tell the men that emotions are the keys to their inner kingdom. And I really believe that once we help men achieve emotional literacy and fluency, that they do have access to a richer life. I know that's certainly been true for me. But I've also come to believe that once we unlock that door of emotions, and there's still a necessary passage, and that's down the hallway, if you will, of grief. At some point, if we do not dive deep into that emotion that we call grief, we never fully have access to the treasures that the other emotions hold for us either. And the reason is because with all of the emotions, if we truncate or limit the lows, the discomfort, we also limit the highs. We truncate and just minimalize the breadth of emotions that we're able to experience. One of the quotes from the book that I'm going to start using, referencing quite a bit here, is from Francis Weller, and he says this: without some measure of intimacy with grief, our capacity to be with the other emotions is greatly compromised. The last metaphor I'll use to talk about that concept is that perhaps if we're indeed a blob of clay, as some people say we started, then grief is what hollows us out and allows us to hold joy at a later time. And the deeper we hollow out, the more joy that we can hold. There's another very common attribute that is associated with grief, and it's that of control. That is loss of control. Grief happens because there's something that occurred that I didn't have control over. Hopefully I didn't cause it, but I certainly seem powerless to stop it. And so when we as men, particularly, I think, feel like we have lost control and don't have that control, we also feel like we are no longer safe, or we can no longer keep those that we love safe. And some of the emotions that might stir up include anger, fear, and maybe even guilt or shame for not being able to keep our loved ones safe. Okay, any questions up to this point? Because what I want to do now is dive into Francis Weller's book and talk about the 5 gateways of grief. Anybody have any comments or anything that we want to say at this point? All right.
Yeah, this is Millen from Vancouver, Canada. Thank you, John. I guess I want to circle back in a way to that whole victim piece, because as I've worked with grief, I kind of like Richard Rohr's characterization as grief is unfinished hurt. And any hurt I received that I just papered over or just moved on, I need to finish that, and grief is the way I finish that hurt. And when I go into that and finish all the hurt of my boyhood and young adulthood, what I find myself always crying about is I feel so bad that happened to me. And then I say, well, you freaking victim, like, get off your knees and get on your feet and start working. And so that's inner critic stuff. But the piece is, am I really grieving if I'm feeling sorry that so many bad things happened to me? And is there another level down that I'm missing? And maybe you're going to talk about that. So that's something around there is my question. I don't actually know what my question is.
Yeah, okay, well, great question. And I don't know that I have an immediate answer, except I would say that there's no easy out here in regards to grief. I wish I could promise you that, listen to my words and you'll be healed and you won't hurt. Bad things will happen, but it won't hurt. That's just not the way it works. The best I can offer is that if we properly process the grief, we can actually enlarge our capacity for emotions in general and enrich our human experience, which then makes us more available and essentially better partners in relationship with other humans. We're both more useful to them, and we just have a capacity to be richer with them. So, and the other thing I would add is that I don't think there's any wrong way to do this. So the work that you're doing has been, I would judge, has been helpful for you at this point. And just the fact that you have to keep doing it doesn't mean that it's being done wrong or anything. gosh, the number of times I've done work around my father, for example, is rather remarkable, and I suspect there will still be some work. Okay, I'm going to move on to the, and then there's another, towards the end when we talk about processes, there might be some helpful things there for you too, in regard to other things to try. I want to talk about the 5 gateways of grief. And to me, when I read this book 4 years ago, this was the most remarkable part of the book to me, because the first gateway is the only one I really knew about, which is that gateway that comes from deep loss. Losing something of such deep value to me that, yes, it touches my soul. And it's the one that we're most familiar with, whether it be a death, divorce, loss of career, loss of financial stability, all kinds of major significant losses are the kind that he's talking about here. And he puts it in a very stark and remarkable statement. The way he says it is that everything we love, we will lose. And the seriousness of that statement still stuns me. Everything I love, I will lose. I might not lose it until I die, but when I die, I'll lose it. And that's a remarkable thing. Grief is a testimony to our love. In fact, I've heard grief described as love with no place to go, no way to be expressed. The deeper that I have loved someone, the deeper my grief is likely to be. In some ways, it's the way that I honor my love for someone is to grieve them. If grief is the way that we honor those who have passed, and it also is a way that we can maintain connection to them. And sometimes I do think that it's possible for people to get stuck in that place that if I stop grieving, first of all, does that mean I didn't love them? Or I don't want to lose my last and final connection with these people. So I'm going to keep grieving. It's the way I stay connected with them. I'm not saying it's bad, but there's a phenomenon there to look at and watch out for. Okay, so that's the first gateway. And then let's dive into some other gateways here. The second one listed is the parts of us that have not known love. The neglected or banished parts of ourselves, or those things that we've been taught to be ashamed. This is essentially grief that's based in shame. That there's parts of me that I believe are unworthy. And one of the phrases we repeat often in this work is that shame is a lie. He offers 3 steps towards healing, and I think these are rather remarkable, in part because, indeed, these are also effective ways to talk about shame. The first is to try to move, whether I'm talking about my own self or my feelings towards someone else, try to move from worthless to wounded. If I can move from the place where I think I'm just worthless to seeing myself as a wounded man, that's an initial first step that gives me a little crack into a healing process. The second step would be to journey from contempt to compassion. So instead of essentially hating myself, if I can cut me or my little boy a little slack, that can also be helpful. And the final is to risk moving from silence to sharing. And this is where I think that our work in iGroups can be so important in helping people pass this part of this, that are stuck or experiencing this level of grief from parts of themselves that they've hidden. Because we create a safe place for people to share. The third gateway is one I think that really applies to our time right now, and it's called Sorrows of the World. It includes earth grief, that is the pain we feel for the desecration of our planet, our Mother Earth. It includes the cumulative grief when we hear in the news over and over of all the people who are suffering, the people who have the coronavirus, the loved ones who can't even go see them in the hospital, can't even claim the body sometimes for a while to bury them, all of those kinds of things. We hear those things, and because we're compassionate beings, that adds to our grief also, and we feel their pain. we grieve and miss our connection with nature. And I would refer you to one of the major processes on the weekend, which is the wild man and gift, that the wild within me seeks the wild without. I want a connection. I believe that I'm designed to have a connection with the wild without. And the other thing that I believe is a huge issue that we're facing right now in terms of this gateway of the sorrows of the world is the destruction and endangerment of things that we cherish. This includes our political situation, our institutions, maybe religious, maybe social, maybe legal, and the destruction of traditions, things that we've counted on for years to be a certain way are suddenly no longer that way. So this gateway of sorrows of the world, when I first read this and heard and thought about it, it gave me permission to put a handle on some really deep feelings I've been having. Personally, I've lived my life doing a lot of environmental work, and it was such a relief to finally understand that, oh yeah, these feelings I've been having, whether they be anger or sadness and frustration, actually have a place, a legitimate place to be. The fourth gateway is what we expected and did not receive. And again, I think this is a rich one. We expected to be born into loving parents who saw, valued, protected, nurtured us. We also perhaps expected to be born into either extended family or a village where that love and nurture was extended out beyond just our parents, and we didn't rely just on them. Another thing that we likely expected was an authentic connection to the world. That could be the natural world, but I believe it's also encompasses that opportunity to contribute. One of my favorite authors, Wendell Berry, talks about what he calls home economics, that kids who are raised in families where they actually have useful chores to do, where they contribute to the health of the family, whether it be financial health or sustenance health, those kids have a sense of place in the world that the kids who grow up in front of screens may not have. We also grew up expecting to touch and to be touched. And that in the last 3-4 weeks has been taken away from us to a large part. We currently right now as humans are really limited in who and even if we can touch and be touched. Another is the security of thoughtful leadership, whether that was by democracy or by a chief or by a benevolent king. That concept that we were born in, we expected to be born into a place where there was a degree of safety and that someone else was looking out for not only our good, but the greater good. And that may be something that some people right now feel is lacking or endangered. So again, pause there and consider all the ways that this gateway of expecting, not receiving what we expected might be playing into your experience of life right now. All right, and the final gateway is what he calls ancestral grief. And this is grief that is essentially inherited. It might be through on the institutional level or cultural level. Examples would be slavery, enslavement, Holocaust victims, genocide of races, any of those kinds of major cultural experiences. Many sociologists believe that is carried on generation to generation, the effects of that. It could also be traumatic events within a family, loss of a young child, for example, can throw the parents into all kinds of mental situations where they're not available emotionally to the other children, which then affects those children in negative ways. There's also the issue of toxic family behavior patterns, whether it be chemical dependency, abuse, and those kinds of things. So that's the final gateway. Is we may have inherited some grief, either in our immediate family structure or even in previous generations, that the effects of affected our parents, our grandparents, and continues to affect us. So I'm going to real quickly recap the 5 gateways of grief. The first is that of deep loss. And the second is, pause for just a minute here as I look, the parts of us that have not known love. And the third is the sorrows of the world. And the fourth is what we expected and did not receive. And the fifth is that ancestral grief. So we're going to go into breakout rooms in just a moment, but I would just ask if there's any comments. And really the question I want to know, did anyone have a real aha moment? It's like, oh my gosh, I've never thought about that particular aspect as being one of the ways in which I'm grieving. Did anyone have that experience? As I did when I read the book. Okay. All right. Well, what I'd like
I'll speak to one point you made, John, which is on your children. I can't remember exactly how it was said, but basically you said the home economy. When I was in clinical practice, I was seeing a family, and the parents were complaining about the teenage son that, he was ungrateful that they didn't even make him take out the garbage. And then I talked to the son, and he said, well, they think I'm worthless. I said, well, give me an example. He says, they don't even let me take out the garbage.
Well, thank you for that, Ed. Yeah, I see it as a pretty important one. There's a part of my brain that likes the fact that we can categorize these different gateways of grief, and it helps me understand them on an intellectual level. The truth is that we as humans don't have these little compartments, and we can be experiencing any or all of these different aspects of grief all at the same time. And indeed, I believe that's really what's happening right now. You may have had some deep personal losses of loved ones or whatever before we started, and now maybe you've lost your job, or the stock market crashed, and you've lost your sense of security in the future. Those are huge losses. And you may have some of these other gateways now operating too, where you're waking up to a world that's very different than what you expected. In fact, what was true for 3 weeks ago, there's a loss of routine, there's a loss of many kinds of security. So part of what may be happening to you or to men in your circles is that they're being overwhelmed by this stuff coming at them from so many different directions, essentially coming through these different gateways of grief, that they don't know how to separate it out and process it. That may be something that now you can help them do.
The key thing is to not wait. We see somebody in our life spiral in a downward spiral, and we kind of want to hold back and hope they pull out of it rather than take the risk of stepping in. The problem is that those kind of downward spirals rarely end well. So I would say the key thing is reach out. The suicide prevention course that we offer, that we give to people when they become members, question, persuade, and refer. That applies here even if it's not suicide. To always ask and persuade the person to get help, and if possible, refer them for help if it's a suicide hotline or like that. But don't be afraid to intervene. It's better to intervene and be wrong than to not intervene and be wrong.
A few closing thoughts here. Here are some of the things that I hope that you can carry forward. The first would be to reframe grief and sorrow as legitimate and welcome parts of the human experience. Some of us were talking about anger as having a bad reputation in our culture, and I would say in many ways grief does too. It's kind of icky, and people try to avoid it. And that was one thing I got from Weller's book, was he sees it as a very positive piece of the human experience. The second thing would be that we're not meant to grieve alone. I said that earlier. Our I groups are ideal places. Men are used to coming there and doing work. If they've been attending for a while, they have some sense of safety and a routine and a variety of assistance and support. So, you know, we may not have the village that we perhaps were intended to be born into, but we do have our I groups, and it's an ideal place to help support men as they process grief. Grief is a gateway emotion is what I titled this presentation, and by that I mean that through grief we also can access all of the other emotions. I gave some examples of that earlier, that, you know, if I'm experiencing anger, it may be in part because I haven't grieved all the changes going on in the world right now. If I'm feeling shame that I'm not able to support my family, you know, I lost my job or for whatever reason right now, that's also can be looked at through the lens of grief. So it's a gateway emotion, and it can help us help men process. One of the real gifts is that when we risk sharing our grief, is that we build greater intimacy and a greater sense of safety within the container. So we're building intimacy within our own lives. And imagine going home and if you have a partner at home, sharing with your partner some of what we talked about tonight and some of the things that may have come up for you around these different gateways. And it might lead to a rich discussion that will deepen your relationship and deepen your connection. It's also about connections to deep values. Because it's grief, because it's soul work, we are connecting at a deeper level than we sometimes do. The last quote I'll give you for the evening is also from Weller. In the midst of great loss, we find ourselves in the presence of the sacred. To me, that's a powerful quote. In the presence of great loss, we find ourselves in the presence of the sacred. And I think that's because it is soul work. And Weller, towards the end of his book, poses 3 questions, and I'm going to share them with you. What is the vow that my soul is longing to make? What might I have to give up in order to honor that vow? And for what does my soul want to be remembered? It's interesting to pose those questions through, not from a place of ego, but from the place of the soul. I'll repeat them one time. What is the vow my soul is longing to make? What might I have to give up in order to honor that vow? And for what does my soul long to be remembered? I'm complete, and I want to say that if any of you think that my presence in your circles, since we're doing online I groups, I would be willing to attend. If you want to pull together some other circle that you think would be helpful to, if I presented what I presented tonight, I'm willing to do that.
Thank you, John, for a really deep and I dare say inspiring presentation. I got a lot out of it, and I'm sure other people did as well. The next Chairs Front Porch in the series will be in 2 weeks, and it'll be on a Thursday. We're moving them around a bit in case people have I groups or other commitments on a given night, so they're not frozen out of it. It's Thursday, May 21st. And there's a brand new program that we just rolled out. In fact, the first iteration of it is already booked solid, and the second one is filling up. So we're going to give you a bit of a preview of that. J.D. Wolf and Stefan McKenzie have put together a program called Living Through Disruption. And it's a good bit longer than an hour, but they'll give you an hour's worth of introduction to it on the 21st at this same time. And we also have coming up Will Keepin and Cynthia Wicks from Gender Equity and Reconciliation Institute, International rather, and some others coming down the pike. So watch for MKP USA broadcast. That's where it'll be announced. And if other people want to know about it, make sure they subscribe to MKP USA broadcast. Paul?
Thanks, Ed, very much. And thanks again, John. I'm going to say a couple things. And John, I'd like us to close with you reading those 3 questions again, if you would. It's our wish that we spend some time together, getting to know each other in these smaller groups and as a bigger group like this, sharing some of the times that we're in right now and what we're going through. So thanks for being here. As Ed said, if you got something out of this and think it's worthy, please come back and join us for the several that we have coming up, and invite others to do the same.
Hope this was of value to you. We're happy as the chairs of the project to bring this to you. And with that, I'll jump over to John.
Okay, and those 3 questions again. What is the vow my soul is longing to make? What might I have to give up in order to honor that vow? And the final is, for what does my soul long to be remembered?
Thank you, man. Thank you, John.
Thanks, everybody.
See you again.